Hello, I'm Jake Lloyd, and welcome to How to Build Community, a podcast and radio show brought to you by Aruka Network. In this episode, we're hearing how a methodology called Asset-Based Community Development, or ABCD, can build relationships and strengthen community life. And talking us through it is this man.
Start with what's strong, not with what's wrong, and then use what's strong to address what's wrong and make what's strong in the community even stronger still. That's how enduring change happens.
That's the voice of Cormac Russell. He's the founder of Nurture Development. And they're an organisation that gets invited by communities and groups all over the world to help them use ABCD to identify what's strong in a community, to make those things stronger, and to use them to fix what's wrong. Now, I'd been hoping to speak to Cormac for quite some time. I'd been hearing different things about his work in Europe and Africa and Asia, and so I was very excited to be able to sit down and chat with Cormac recently. And when I started the interview, I began by asking him how he first became passionate about community development.
I was raised in the west of Ireland, and I grew up in the rural parts of a city called Limerick. Community was really just part of how we lived our lives. So I'm coming in towards my 50s now. I know that's changed a lot over the years, but certainly as a child growing up in the west of Ireland, it was very much about community life. So I think that was just in the bloodstream really from a very, very young age. And over time, obviously, as I grew older and a little bit clearer about what I wanted to do, I sort of moved into the whole field of psychology and started working a lot with children who were looked after by the state for various reasons. So kids who, you know, would have been in community care or whatever the terms that are used these days are. And it just really struck me that a lot of these kids were receiving neither community nor care. They were effectively institutionalized, but we put a different badge on it. Not the awful big institutions of years past, but, you know, similar principles. They were surrounded by people with the same issues as they had, were looked after by people who were paid to look after them, and really didn't have any connections with the neighbors on the street where the houses were. So I became really interested in that question. Like, what would you do in a situation like that? And initially began to realize that what I had trained to be as a psychologist, well, there was no answers in that domain. There was no real useful answers in that field. And that's a bit of a shocker when you first let it settle. But then it became quite exciting to kind of think, okay, so how might we help these kids, you know, get connected with people who don't feel sorry for them, but actually see them as valuable people, see them as neighbors, maybe friends. And that's been my life's question, really, for the last, 25, nearly 30 years. If you're paid at one level, but also if you're not paid, but how do you do something usefully that supports people to show up and participate as citizens?
You use the term institutionalize there, and looking on your website, you talk about reducing institutionalization. Can you just tell me what you mean by that and why institutionalization is so harmful?
I can. My own feeling would be probably layered in with my answer as well as theory. So at a feeling level, I think what people really need in life is someone to love, somewhere to live, and something meaningful to do. So I'm not fundamentally attacking institutions, but I think that there are limits to what institutions can do in those domains. Mm-hmm. So typically an institution is set up to provide goods and services for people, and it has lots and lots of caring people within the institution. But an institution, in my estimation, can never be a surrogate or a proxy for a family or a community. If you think about how an institution is structured, even the non-hierarchical ones, they kind of work on the basic principle is that they exist to enable things to happen that are not centrally reliant on any one person. Right. So, you'll often hear this, that when anybody should be able to do this. If you go in the morning, your CEO might say to you, if you're gone in the morning, this should continue. This institution and our work should continue. And we all laud that. But another way of thinking about that is that means that the institution depersonalizes. It's not about you. Now, community and family personalize. This morning, I brought my kids to school. I have 3 young boys, and I know their foibles. Their mum is in hospital at the moment, nothing serious, but so they need an extra little bit of minding because they're anxious about their mum. And I know how Saul, one of my sons, likes his porridge, and he likes some Cheerios on top of his porridge. It's really particular stuff, very personal. And I'm not providing him with a service or a good. This is care. It's the freely given gift of the heart, and institutions don't do that. Now, my sort of take on it is that institutions don't care, that people do. And that doesn't make institutions bad. It makes them limited. And what we've tried to do, I believe, is we've tried to make institutions do more things than institutions are designed to do. And in the process, we've taken functions that belong to families and communities, and we've outsourced them to institutional roles. If you look 100 years ago at what communities would have seen as their role when it came to teaching and helping their children learn, and you look at the number of functions over the course of 100 years, and this is in Africa too, I see it there too. We do a lot of work in Kenya and Rwanda, in South Sudan. And I'm seeing over and over again, functions that would have belonged to the village are now being taken on by paid professionals. So my theory is that the more we do that, the more institutions take on community functions, the more you see the erosion of citizens. So the greater those functions are in the professional space, the more and more you see the retreat of community. So there's a power relationship. And that's why so many communities think the only way things can get better is if somebody with expertise, with institutional know-how, with money comes in to make them better. And this is a big issue all over Africa. But particularly in East Africa, we see huge dependency on NGOs coming in. And again, it's the tyranny of the expert. And nobody means any harm, but the difficulty with it is that institutions also silo. They specialize. And of course, we're now really understanding through complexity theory, and what we've understood always, I think, in the community space, is you can never solve only one issue. When you think about community, and you think about the village as your primary unit of change rather than the institution or the individual, then you start to really understand, okay, silos are where smart people go to do dumb things, and communities are where ordinary people go to do amazing things.
Wow.
And that's where I've really begun to see, very authentic change happen and enduring change happen.
So let's rewind a bit again. And so you were working in child psychology and you saw the need for connection and community. Tell me then how you first heard about ABCD and what was its appeal to you?
Well, what I was looking for was some way of bridging the gap between what I saw as these young people's capacities. That was just my own instinct. That it's always clear to me when I meet people for the first time that they have capacities. So I think that's just the way I kind of came into the world. That's my kind of filter. And I was curious about how you could link those to the capacities of people around them, but not for pay. So, how do you get near neighbors connected in with these kids just because it's fun? So my thought was, well, I haven't been trained to do this. This is just purely by instinct, but it seemed obvious that you would look at different ways of doing that through community development as a lens, so I had that kind of sense, community development is surely they answer questions about how you build relationships between people who are marginalized and the wider community. And so I started looking around at different approaches to community development. And to be honest, Jake, most of what I encountered was community development that was working almost exclusively with named target groups like older people or younger people or people who had a particular issue, and largely helping them to organize to get the system world or the institutional world to do something to fix the problem. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I've shared already my thoughts around the limits of that, but it can be useful. You know, it can address some key issues. But what it wasn't doing was answering the question I was asking. And I was asking the question largely because it seemed to me as an ethical practitioner that was the substantive question. Like what these kids wanted were connections. Not just with paid people, and they'd lost connections with their family. So it seemed to me that, you know, building community was pretty much an urgent thing, a necessity, if you like, in their lives. So that for me was the kind of starting point. I couldn't find anything that was really speaking to it in the community development world. I'm sure maybe I didn't look adequately enough in Europe, but then my gaze turned to what was happening in the US and to the work of John McKnight and the ABCD Institute. And that was in and around about the time that they published the what we now affectionately refer to as the Green Book, the Building Communities from Inside Out, an asset-based approach to community building. So it was in and around about 93, 94. And that book subsequently went on then to be the best-selling book ever in community development, which is interesting. I think it's sold about 150,000 copies, which is almost unheard of, actually, when you think about, you know, community development books tend to be niche. So if you sell 15,000, that's amazing. So over the course of time, I reached out to John in the mid-90s, and we started doing some stuff together. And I tried some of the asset-based approach in my work, and found I didn't have a huge amount of space to stretch and grow. I got some, but subsequently left. So I left that role in 95, really convinced that there was something really powerful in the, not so much the ABCD approach, but in how the world looked when you looked at it through the lens of ABCD, if that made sense. And I thought, well, okay, I need to do something about this. So I set up my own social enterprise and literally just started exploring. So I did that in 96.
And this was nurture development? This is
nurture development, yeah. And I've just been going ever since, really, from one conversation to the next.
So tell us, for people who've not heard of it, tell us the basic idea behind ABCD.
Well, I suppose the kind of basic idea in simple terms is you start with what's wrong instead of what's wrong in any given instance. That's not to say we shy away from issues or problems, but even like that, if somebody says, well, you know, I really care about a particular problem, what we're really asking is okay, so what resources do you have locally and within your control that you could begin to use to start to address that? So it's looking at that kind of question of what are the things that need to be addressed locally for us to have good lives, that we as local people are prepared to work together to address, and what are the local resources that we could use to do that. And that doesn't foreclose on outside agencies helping. What it does say is that there's a sequence, and the optimum sequence, if you want a democratic, powerfully engaged citizenry, is to start with, so what can we do ourselves alone, just using local resources? That's the first level. The second level is, what can we do with some help from outside resources, but basically where we're in the lead as local people. And then finally, what do we need done for us? So it's this kind of idea that communities, societies grow better when they grow from bottom up. And that three-way questioning process is the sequence. And the critique of ABCD is that currently what's happening is the opposite. That we start with the third question: what can the outside agencies do to us or for us, as opposed to looking at our own assets and resources And so the idea in terms of what our assets are, the assets of local residents that give skills, talents, knowledge, passions, the assets of local associations, the clubs, the groups, the social networks, the local institutions that support community life, the place itself, and the stories of that place are the key assets. And of course, the economy and the exchanges, not just economic exchanges. So that's it in a nutshell. I mean, I've given you a very quick account, but that's the essence of it.
And looking at your website and social media, you've been all over the world, it seems, going into communities and delivering or whatever you would call it, this ABCD. Can you give us some stories or examples of what you've done, where you've done it, and what the impact has been?
Boy, there's so much. And I haven't done anything really. It's largely you can see our role as a cheerleader role. So for me, a lot of what we're doing is we're cheering people on. Maybe, a couple of incisive questions. I don't think we're just cheering people on. We're bringing kind of powerful lenses and frameworks. And we've been very, very privileged to do that in different places. So some examples, in Singapore, we're helping across Singapore over the last number of years. We've helped them reimagine social work from its focus, which would have been very much on case management, into a community development style approach. So that's one extreme example where you're working with institutions to think about the way they change really as institutions. Then at the other extreme, working very, very closely with communities and schools in the Gasabo district in Rwanda, where they wanted to that a lot of the schools had been built by parents, but the parents themselves wanted to think about how they could make the school experience much, much more powerful, both for the teachers and for the pupils, and in a way that really drew on the capacities of the local community. So it's been a really interesting process in Rwanda over the last 3 years. We've trained community builders who use an asset-based approach, go into schools, speak with parents, remind parents that they've got skills, they've got capacities, that their children do too, and then ask them, rather than, what's the problem and what funding can we get to fix the problem, they say, what would you like to do? What do you want to address? And how can we support you to do that? So the community builders have been working with parents to address one of the really big issues, which is that teachers weren't always showing up for class because they weren't always getting a monthly salary in Rwanda. And beginning to think about, okay, how do we do something practically about that? Lovely ideas emerging using local assets. So, for example, turning the school into a marketplace at the weekend where teachers could buy produce at a third of the price that they would pay in a mainstream market, paying using time banking credits. So a teacher would get paid, their salary would be topped up with time credits, which they could then use to trade in to ask parents who have particular skills to do things like make their daughter a dress, for example. So the parents were actually beginning to use other currencies to top up the salary of the teachers. That really, really changed the way teachers thought about their role. They showed up a lot more. Kids were a lot happier in school. And then we come to other work that we've done in the UK, where, for example, in one particular community in Scotland, the Scottish government have evaluated our work independently over the last 3 years and have shown that by having a community builder, actually it's in 6 different neighbourhoods. There's a community builder in each of these neighbourhoods in a place called South Ayrshire, which is outside of Glasgow, that mental health issues have reduced, GP visits have reduced, and more importantly, mental health and well-being has increased. Interestingly, not just with the people who engaged in community activities, but across the general population. And this is just by having a community builder working at street level, connecting people to each other, to what their passions are, to what they want to do, and to the local assets. And then, obviously, once some activity gets done around that, moving forward. Another favorite example of mine is a community in Hodge Hill in Birmingham, where the local vicar used an asset-based approach and invited 7 of his neighbours to begin what they called a listening campaign, where they went out to try to find connectors, local residents who were really good at connecting people in relationships in the community. And this was across a population of 5,000 people. So they found 93 people, they call them unsung heroes. And they went and said thank you to each of them and invited them to a party, but asked them to bring some of their local neighbours with them from their street. They kind of went from 1 to 7 to 93 to, hundreds, and now thousands of people.
Just a practical question. You're invited into a community then, or into a institution?
It can vary. An institution, typically. Well, it's not typically always we're invited in. We don't insinuate ourselves. I mean, obviously, people can go on the website, and I hope we reasonably clearly articulate what our offer is, or the kinds of conversations we'd have, or the training that we'd offer. And then yet people would invite us in, so a council might say, look, we'd like you to come in and work with us, but also there are a number of neighborhoods that are interested too. And so we might, for example, spend a couple of years in a place, myself or a team member, where we're in pretty deep relationship with the different organizations and with different communities, trying to grow what we call learning sites. So these are living expressions. This is doing it and learning as we go. Yeah, so that can vary. And we've supported the establishment of learning sites with our partner in Australia, Bank of Ideas. So we've been working quite closely with them as well. And across Australia now, there are about maybe 30 of these learning sites as well. And really, it's people doing the work and then sharing about what they're learning. So rather than ABCD is not a model, it's a framework. It really is about giving people the space and the encouragement to say, look, why don't you figure out how this applies in your context and make sense of it? There's some core principles. Let's try to be true to them. But this isn't about imposing a model on you. It's about figuring out what works in this place and what's relevant to here.
Are you a business or a charity?
We're essentially a social enterprise. But always, and it's been interesting. I've stayed away from being a charity intentionally because of the ethos of what we do. And so I thought it would be quite interesting to have to sing for our supper and really try to, if it was going to work, try and make it about, well, people are bringing us in because they feel there's value add. And if there isn't, we either have to figure out how to bring some or we don't survive. And I quite like that idea of constantly having to figure out how we can be useful in this space. And one of the difficulties, I think, with the old charity model is this, not all charities are like this. This isn't a critique of charities, but the charity model per se, you can fall into doing things for people. And you can also, I think, if you're funded, you can end up being quite dependent on that funding. And that was something I wanted to avoid.
Yeah, related to this, when you are a charity, as Aruka Network is, that there's an impetus to demonstrate your impact and the impact of your work. And prior to this interview, I sent you questions of what I'd like to talk about, and one of which was, tell me some stories of where you think your work's had most impact. When you're talking about something that's so kind of broad as community, what is impact? What does impact mean to you?
Well, first of all, I suppose is what impact means to the community is the core substantive question, not what it means to the donor and not what it means to a provider. That's the critical distinction. Most of what donors are asking, the ones that are not, I think, fit for purpose, are asking is, how are you achieving what we want to achieve? So you are our handmaid. We're investing in you. And you're helping us get the results that we believe are going to create a better world. And I think that's the wrong way around, frankly. I mean, it's not wrong, it's a bit dramatic, but it's probably more helpful in the longer term to say, what is it the community want to achieve? How are you supporting them to achieve it?
Mm-hmm.
Or another way, you could even say as a donor, I mean, this is quite interesting. As a donor, you may be interested in health or safety or some other such thing. But one of the things that I would say that being serious about community work does is it immediately puts you in a situation where if you say we're going to invest in social capital, and if we get impact with regard to anything related to social capital, we will get impact by proxy in relation to our core mission.
Can you just define what you mean by social capital?
Well, what I'm talking about in practical terms is citizen participation. So more people being involved with their neighbors, doing stuff that makes things better in their place, whether that's their village, town, outer estate, whatever it might be. We know that when people contribute to the well-being of their community, they get better themselves, they get safer. So, in all kinds of ways, there are better economic opportunities. So you just begin to see, like evidentially, all kinds of really, really powerful impacts. So I'm very struck sometimes by that. And I would say to donors, and you can see it in some of our evaluations, when you begin to really think about the evidence frame that you're looking at here, we can draw very clear links between the number of people who are connected and are involved now as against who weren't involved previously, and the kinds of impacts that you're after, But I suppose one of the things I'm very keen to do with donors is to train them so that they understand as well how they can show up in a useful way and be really supportive to the community, So yeah, it's very interesting. It's the evidence. Going back to the social capital question, the evidence is that if you weren't connected this year to a group, a club, a social network of any kind, actively, in a participative way, not just going and making the tea, but actively connected, and you get connected, you reduce your chance of premature death the following year by up to 50%.
Wow.
Now that's impact. And now, like if somebody says to me they have a drug or they have a professional institutional intervention that can compete with that, I'd love to see it. But it's just evidence frame. Brooke K. Labour market participation, the influence of social capital is really, so this is the ONS labour market trend analysis, gives us evidence that says you're 4 times more likely to find work through friends than through a job center. Okay?
Wow.
That's the evidence, right? This is just fascinating. There's a meta-analysis of social capital in health, which is done for the Journal of Health Psychology, I think last year. And it says clearly that living in a supportive community increases our chances of good health by 27%. Right?
Amazing.
We have evidence around from Robert Sampson's work, a wonderful book called When Disaster Strikes, It's the Survival of the Sociable. Don't you love that? It's the survival of the sociable. So this was published in 2016 in The New Scientist, which definitively says stronger neighborhoods have significantly less crime. And then in the UK, where you're from, last year, the Guardian piece, Monabot's piece around the wonderful village of Frome showed that across the whole of Somerset, right, emergency hospital admissions rose by 29% during the 3 years of the study they did. And in Frome, with a site where they were trying to build community to combat isolation, it fell by 17% in the same period. So that's impact, I would say.
Our second ever interviewee on this podcast was a guy from Frome talking about exactly that. It was about 1.5 years ago.
Who was that?
Oh, he was
Julian. Was it Julian?
No, he was from just one social enterprise called the Library of Things.
Yes,
but he
I know it.
Yeah, he gave a whole background to Frome, and it's quite an incredible story, really.
Very interesting. So, and what's interesting is these are not unusual places, and the work that has caused that impact. And impact's a good question. I think, what would be the impact is not a bad question. But I think, as is with funding, I often say that because we started the question of impact with funding, that funding should be seen as the bait, not the fish. And so, you take it, how do we use the funding to increase the social capital to get those kinds of impacts so that when the funding isn't there, the social capital remains and the impacts sustain? And, or if it is there, on an ongoing basis, how can we ensure that that's truly owned by the community and they haven't become dependent? Because that's the other question, you see, linking back to what we were saying earlier on. For me, it seems that the more people are interdependent at the center of their community, with services, obviously, as they need them in reserve, but the more they're interdependent as opposed to being dependent on external funding or external resources, the more powerful they are then when they sit with donors. Because I think what they say then is they say, well, look, we're not passive recipients here, and we're not your handmaids. We are citizens, powerful people who have taken care to bring others with us, including those that have been marginalized. And we have a real sense of what will work around here. And we'd like to invite you in to help us to extend that capacity so we can have more impact. That's the conversation, I think, that really makes change happen. And I think the conversations that are driven externally, where, the donor or the local government or whatever it might be is saying, well, we've studied you, and here are all the deficiencies. Here are all the things that are wrong with you. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to take the elites among you who are social entrepreneurs, or maybe we'd like to get some elites from outside of you, because you're the sum of your problems and you're beyond fixing from inside out. So we're going to get outside in solutions for you. And all you have to do is passively receive them. I mean, it doesn't take a moment's thought to say that's nonsense.
Yeah.
And yet, that's the conversation that prevails.
Yeah. Can we just move on slightly? You're in quite a privileged position in the sense of you've been to communities all over the world and doing this work. I wonder what has struck you in terms of just the similarities or the differences between, I don't know, community in East Africa or in the west of Ireland or in Singapore or wherever.
I think it's that great anthropological insight that there is only one race, the human race. And that culture is what makes us different. And it's beautiful, and that culture, we have 6,000 languages, living languages in the world today. Half of them are dying. So culture is really the great undervalued way that human beings figure out how to prevail, is the great innovation. When we're in a place, we as a community figure out how we're going to prevail in this place, how we're going to survive. And that's where language and where faith perspectives and how we raise our children and our stories and art and dance and so forth come from. And for me, that's the thing that is the constant. I suppose the other thing, as well as culture, in that sense that our differences are really down to the fact of where we find ourselves, as we kind of emerged out of Africa and, migrated in response to climate change and in response to the migrating, patterns of our animals. And then we came in to settle, and move to grain and agriculture and things like that, that you still begin to see, if you look at communities through the lens of abundance rather than scarcity, that every community has three things that are universal. And the first, it may not necessarily be visible to everybody in the community, but they're there in every community. And the first is that every single person in a community has gifts. They have something to contribute to the well-being of the community. Whether they know that or not is kind of, that's the conversation to be had. But every single person, even people who've been unfortunately labeled, has something vital and vitalizing to contribute to their community. One of the things that makes me very sad sometimes is how many people I meet and how many communities I meet where people haven't discovered that truth and that kind of abundant mindset. But the second thing that's abundant in every community, even if it isn't actualized or animated, is hospitality. And over and over and over again, I've never been in a community where I haven't received hospitality. And particularly if I'm not trying to sell them something or sell them out, I receive hospitality. And the third is associations. Even in Calais, over the period of the arrival of our brothers and sisters from Syria, and
this is a refugee camp in France. Camp.
Remember, they suffered most horrible circumstances for people who'd already gone through so much. But literally, I guess people did the best they could do. But it was incredible to see how associational life and enterprises emerged even in that environment. So I'm really, really struck by how people associate. And what I mean by associate, in the same way as you have a flock of birds, you have an association of citizens, groupings of people who come together and figure out how they can do together what they can't do alone. So I often kind of joke, as a way of thinking about this, is you could be a beautiful singer, but no matter how good you are and no matter how beautiful a voice you have, you will never be a choir on your own. Mm-hmm. So there's this device that we have in human life called gift exchange, called hospitality, called associational life, which I believe is central to our well-being, to how we raise our children, to how we age, to the safety we have, to our economic prosperity, and to our very democracies, whether we understand democracy in a kind of classic Western sense, or whether we understand it in the sense like in the Indonesian culture, they talk about gotong royong, this principle of contributing to your neighbor without expectation of return, which predates democracy. And it's about how we're human, how we get better at being human together. I see that in every place that I'm in, every place without exception.
Amazing. I want to ask just two more quick questions. Firstly, what is the hardest thing about your work?
The hardest thing, the work itself is not hard at all. It's very joyful, really. I love it. The travel. It worries me because I'm away from my family, but also it's not good for the environment. So that's hard. And I have to make some really tough ethical choices about that. So I'm aware of that and feel somewhat compromised sometimes. Not sure I'm always making the best choice, but that's hard. So I wrestle with that. But the other stuff, tends not to worry me so much. I think when I was younger, I spent a lot of time trying to reform institutions, and I've given up on doing that now. I'm much more interested in reseeding associational life and supporting, change outside of institutions, which is ironic because I spend so much time now in institutions, essentially convincing them to seed their innovation as far away from the institution as possible. So I just had a conversation before this one with somebody who's trying to support community building and citizen life. And I was just saying, the one thing you want is to make sure that you don't seed that change within your organization, because your organization's too big. It will just produce antibodies to kill off the innovation, and just helping them to think about how they could resource very, very small indigenous local groups to be the hosts of those kinds of changes. And they were quite excited about that. So interestingly, I think this idea of being less worried about our institutions and more focused on our communities is changing our institutions as well.
Wow. Finally, for people listening to this who've been, inspired by you and ABCD and your work, what kind of one piece of advice or what one question would you ask or give to these people?
The basic premise here always in life, and it's not peculiar to ABCD, is to believe that the people, if you're serving people and you're trying to help change happen, that the people that you're serving have sharper minds and more noble hearts than you do. And if you're prepared to work with the audacious assumption that the best solutions happen from inside out, And you will reach a point of limit. There will be things that can't happen locally. But if you start with that assumption, you'll start with discovery rather than delivery. And I think that's a big, big challenge. So just kind of shift away from the delivery mindset, which the World Bank promote and the Gates Foundation are very, very into delivery and scaling up. I would really commend that people scale down and they shift from delivery to discovery. The second thought would be start with contact rather than selling your content. Too many of us go in with agendas. Even community leaders, we've got our agendas. We're trying to convert people, or we're trying to grow foot soldiers and followers. Much, much better to just listen, give people a good listening to, and make contact. If we want to be effective, we've got to be affective. Build the relationships. That's what community is all about. And the final thought is what we started with. Start with what's strong, not with what's wrong, and then use what's strong to address what's wrong and make what's strong in the community even stronger still. That's how enduring change happens. Most people who are listening to this will have had a mentor who will have said to them, your job is to work yourself out of a job. Well, that's how you do it.
That's Cormac Russell there talking about asset-based community development. And you can learn more about his work on the website nurturedevelopment.org. And you can also learn more about our work at Aruka Network on our website, which is arukanetwork.org. And I'll spell it for you again. Aruka is Arukah. And don't forget, you can catch up with any episode you might have missed from this show on our SoundCloud page or in your podcast player. Just search How to Build Community Aruka Network. And you can also email me directly with any feedback or comments or suggestions on this show. Just send your message to jake@arukanetwork.org. I would love to hear from you. Until next time, bye for now.